Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Tonight, joining me in studio is Terry Carzones, who's the Vermont State Court Administrator. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Well, this is great to have you. I didn't realize you started your job in July, you said?
July 1.
Very nice. Good way to start the summer, my goodness. Just walking into the fire. Could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you became the Vermont State Court Administrator?
Sure, Pat. So I was admitted to practice law in Vermont in 1982 after having met my husband, who's from Vermont, in law school. And I got married the week after I took the bar exam, trying to have as much stress as possible in a short period of time. And we practiced in Rutland, Vermont for 25 years in a firm that his father had started in the late 50s, a general practice law firm. And then he was appointed to the bench at about the time of the restructuring, if you remember the restructuring of the courts.
Yes, I do. Very well.
2010, when the county courthouses were combined with the state courthouses for one unified court system. And in conjunction with that restructuring, they created a court management position that I then served in that role, overseeing the Rutland, Bennington, and Addison courts. And I did that for several years. And then I don't know if you knew Bob Paolini, who was longtime.
I know him well.
I
yes.
bet.
Yeah.
Longtime executive director at the Vermont Bar Association. He retired in 2016, and I had been active in the Vermont Bar Association and was encouraged to apply for that position, and I served in that role then until this past July when Pat Gable, longtime court administrator, retired. And so that's how that's
great. And you told me Bob came back?
You know, it's funny. So when I came on as court administrator, we asked him, and he very graciously agreed to serve as interim executive director.
Great.
Well, he did, but then he decided then that, you know, this is great being back. So now he is the executive director at the Vermont Bar Association.
Good for him.
Oh, I'm so excited because he'll be at the State House.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, he knows his stuff, that's for sure. That's great.
Yeah.
And I knew before Pat was Bob Greenmore.
Right, Greeny.
And I knew him very well because I was commissioner of personnel back then. So I was always over in his office or he was in mine or something. Before we get started talking about the job, I wanted to talk. I thought this might put things into context. You were asked to speak over at the University of Peking School of Transnational Law in Shenzhen, China. And the reason I was interested, the lecture that was entitled The Role of the Bench and the Bar in Preserving the Rule of Law. And I thought, what a great way to discuss and put all of this discussion into context. So could you talk a little bit about summarizing that lecture, which probably went on more than 10 minutes, but you know.
It did. It was kind of interesting. So my husband, Court, who was a trial court judge at the time, and I, in my role at the VBA, we had been invited to lecture. I don't know if you know U.S. District Court Judge Jeffrey Crawford.
I do.
Okay, so he had law clerks from this university in Shenzhen working at his court in Rutland. And I had invited them to come to different bar functions, whether it was the Rutland County Bar Association or the Vermont Bar Association. Right. And in talking with them, Court and I had friends from law school who were working in Hong Kong at the time, and they had invited us to visit. So I'd mentioned this to the young ladies, and not realizing that Hong Kong was just an hour away from Shenzhen, China. So they then invited us to come speak at their law school, and that was the topic that they asked us to present. Mainly it was just a basic overview of the kind of core principles of the Constitution and the protections that are afforded litigants, the independent judiciary, the separation of powers, impartial judges, kind of all the things that are the tenets of our court system. So we presented that, and then from the bar perspective also talking about access to justice and a lawyer's responsibility to provide pro bono in work in Vermont. There are 50 hours of pro bono work it's an aspirational goal that all attorneys annually are asked to meet. So talking about that as well, which was something not really common in the legal system in China.
So I actually never knew this after all these years. So every attorney is sort of suggested that they put in 50 hours of pro bono, which means free. I'm sure everybody knows that, but no, that's good for us.
And actually, Vermont scored very high. They did a nationwide survey asking how many hours of pro bono, and I think Vermont was second or third in the country in terms of hours per attorney, per year. Many attorneys exceed the 50 hours, believe me. But
I would think that would give you a much broader perspective on people's issues and troubles, because people that may not be able to afford an attorney may have different problems or see things a little bit differently than others, which would help you in just how
you're exactly
you
right.
look at the law.
You're exactly right, and actually that happens quite often. If an attorney takes on a low bono project or a pro bono project, they learn about an area of law that they might not have experience in their regular practice. And it is a way to broaden your knowledge and to help people that otherwise would just be trying on their own to figure it out, which is really, complicated.
Yeah, no, you need help. Having been there myself, you definitely need help. But anyway, that's a great experience. That's wonderful.
It was really interesting, and it was very interesting, too, how candid the students were.
Oh, good.
And in China, law schools are actually a relatively recent phenomenon in China. Within the past decades, and this the Peking School of Transnational Law apparently is the only law school in the world that offers both a Chinese law degree and an American Juris Doctorate degree. And they said, I think 40% of their students spent at least a semester abroad. Many of them were looking to work in the United States, for example. And the other another interesting thing, Pat, in Vermont, for example, the pass rate for the bar exam is about 50%, which we think of as, being low. The pass rate for the bar exam in China is 10%.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming that the license is accepted here. If they issue a license for
in China,
is it accepted here if somebody comes over?
Yeah, I don't know that there's reciprocity there. The American Bar Association would, I think, oversees that kind of.
It'd be interesting if that also equates to be fun to go over there and get your law degree there plus a Chinese law degree. How?
Yeah, and I don't. In all honesty, I think the students there were not. I don't remember there being American students in the law school. Okay. But anyway, it was just a really interesting experience.
Excellent. And well, thank you, Terry. We're going to take a break for just a minute to hear from our sponsor, and then we'll be right back with you. Thank you. Okay, we're back with Terry Carzones, who's the Vermont State Court Administrator, and I'm Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont. So, Terry, could you tell us what are the duties of the Court Administrator?
Well, in essence, the Vermont Supreme Court sets policy in terms of court management, court administration, by virtue of the Vermont Constitution. Yeah. And the Court Administrator implements those policies, basically. Ensures that court operations follow the policies and everybody involved in the judiciary, which there are 4 basic divisions in the court administrator's office. Chief of them is the trial court operations division, which is what happens in the courthouses and in the courtrooms, for example. So it's judicial officers and court staff, court personnel. But in addition, there's also the Technology Services Center. So those are the people that handle all the technology involved with the courts, and that has taken on an extremely critical role since the pandemic, if you can imagine, with the pivot to remote hearings. So making sure that all of the technology is working properly in the courts. There's also the e-filing and case management system that's now all completely electronic, and IT support, and also data, which is so critical. They oversee all the data compilations. In addition, there's planning and court services, so they cover, for example, guardians ad litem and the juvenile docket, treatment courts, interpreters, the website, those kinds of supports. And then there's finance and administration, and they cover not just the budget, but also security and facilities. So, for example, the courthouses with all the HVAC work that was done during the pandemic.
Right, during the pandemic, right.
Right. Yeah. So those are kind of all of the divisions that are basically involved with supporting what to me is the core central function of the mission, and that is what's happening in the courthouses and in the courtrooms, so that Vermonters have their day in court.
And I was going to talk about the structure of the courts, but it's hard to read this all right on the TV here because everybody's eyes will glaze over. But as you said, there are 4 divisions within the management, and you're responsible for all 14 counties and everything, right?
Right, the judiciary encompasses 14, there are 14 units since the
I hope you have a good
restructuring.
staff, which I'm sure you do.
Oh, I am so blessed by the staff. It's interesting, Pat, because when I worked in the courts, for example, after the restructuring, when you work on the other side of the counter, you have no idea what it's like. But I was always so impressed by the dedication of court staff. It's not an easy job.
No,
I mean, it
for sure.
requires a lot of knowledge and expertise. There's so many rules, there's so many statutes, and you have to, provide customer service with people that are typically at their, at their worst days in court. Nobody wants to be typically in court. So helping them and providing very competent and caring assistance. But working in the court administrator's office, same thing. I had no idea, and I'm so impressed by the dedication and how hard they work to make sure that all of these operations are happening.
That's great.
Yeah.
In something I read, it said the Supreme Court Justice administrates the Vermont court system with the assistance of the court administrator and the chief superior judge. Now, what is his or her role? Do you work closely with them, and what do they oversee?
So the chief superior judge currently is Judge Thomas Zone. I don't know if you've met him. New in the last year and a half, maybe.
Yep.
When Judge Grierson retired.
Yep.
Judge Zone.
We know the judge.
Yeah, succeeded him.
Everybody knows Grierson.
And like Judge Grierson, Judge Zone, I think, has such perfect qualifications for the job because he was a practicing attorney. He also, I think, was in law enforcement before he became an attorney.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then he was
good
on
for
the
him.
bench like Judge Grierson.
Yep.
And I have a ton of respect for the job that he does. He basically is he oversees all the judges, all the judicial officers, the trial judges, the magistrates, the hearing officer, and the Judicial Bureau. And we work together.
That's great.
Constant kind of communication and interaction. And one very nice thing about working with Judge Zone, he and I were both lawyers at the same time in Rutland.
Oh, great.
And then we were both active in the Vermont Bar Association, so I worked with him on the Vermont Board of Bar Managers. And then we served on the Human Rights Commission together, actually also at about the time he was appointed. Oh. And then when I worked in the courts, he was also, kind of a new trial judge then. So we've had kind of decades of chances to work together, but he just really is so knowledgeable. And I think has such good common sense and knows what kind of is effective in the courtroom and knows from a judge's perspective, what's realistic, what's not. So he's great to work with.
That's great, especially since you're sort of new together, but you've got to know each other, so that's easier, I'm sure, the transition.
It's really I really am lucky to be working with him.
That's wonderful. So you mentioned the pandemic, but you came in, it says here May 2022. It's right in the middle of things, wasn't it? I mean, it was pretty much, the courts were closed.
Right.
How did you guys,
Well, keeping in mind the pandemic happened in March of 2020.
Yeah.
And from then, the courts did basically, they never shut down in the sense that things didn't happen because there were always emergencies that were tended to, whether it was criminal arraignments, whether it was juvenile emergencies, relief from abuse, et cetera. But any non-emergency matters were definitely kind of set to the side. Right.
And that's an issue we're going to talk about, the backlog.
Right.
Yeah.
We did then, one silver lining of the pandemic, if you will, is it did free up monies that were used to pivot to the remote hearings. Because we would never have had the ability to get all the technology and all the equipment that was necessary to bring the remote hearings, but for the pandemic monies.
Now, you used to do arraignments. I think you and I talked about this. When I was Commissioner of Motor Vehicles, that was a big issue. Yeah. Nobody wanted to do arraignments by remote because you couldn't tell if they were lying and their body language and all this stuff. But obviously we've had to progress from that, and we're doing the courts.
You're exactly right, Pat. Before the pandemic, there might have been a phone on the bench, with a staticky, connection.
Right.
But now every court room in the state is equipped with large screens and the ability to have the audio, video kind of instantaneous. connections have improved. We do, of course, have those areas of the state where broadband is not up to
Right.
speed, and you still, like in the legislature, they might lose somebody who's testifying,
Right.
lose a connection.
The last mile, they call, right? The last mile. Everybody who runs promises we're going to get to the last mile, but
Right.
not yet.
I've heard it likened to when they brought electricity to the country. It's like some
Exactly.
areas it took a while, but
Right.
but we were able to, once we could have the remote hearings, then have more court operations on a more normal level. With the isolation distances, though, and all the health restrictions, it definitely slowed things down and made it a challenge to schedule the court hearings. And it's when you have court hearings that you move cases.
Yeah.
So that really did it exacerbated the
And I'm
backlog
sure not
situation.
all Vermonters, especially in the rural areas, have the ability to participate remotely.
No, you're right. And part of our kind of strategy, too, is how to bring tools to them, whether
Right.
it's in the courts, whether it's in town clerk offices or libraries or whatever, to be able to enable them to connect.
Right.
But it's interesting, Pat, the remote hearings actually have also been really helpful in increasing access to justice in remote areas where people do have connections, because they no longer have to, for example, take a day off of work to drive an hour
you
or
go.
two to the
Right.
courthouse, or to get childcare
Right.
if they can actually do the hearing from a room in their home.
Yep.
So it's been a blessing that way too, because it has enabled people to connect, and we've had actually higher participation rates
Great.
for people because of that, and fewer requests for continuances, because people
They can get there.
can,
Right.
they have more flexibility.
I noticed in the legislature, because you're going to be up there testifying on the budget, but the room is maybe 10, 12 people max from the public. But on Zoom, you get 45, 50 people watching legislation in action, and they can watch the courts as well, and I think that's great.
Right, and a lot of courts are set up for WebEx is the platform that's used in the courtrooms.
Yep.
And hearings were almost exclusively remote for the time when we had, so many restrictions and all the, questions and people not being able to appear if they had
Right.
COVID or had been exposed to COVID. Now, it's interesting, it's developed into, we want to continue to take advantage of all the benefits of remote hearings, but hearings are now back in person. And people can participate remotely, and some are hybrid, where you might
great,
have
great.
persons in person and participating remotely. And we're trying to figure out the best balance to take advantage of this new tool, but to also recognize that there are some proceedings and some types of hearings where in person really is better.
Right.
For example, jury trials. Jury trials are in person, for example. And oftentimes when you have evidence or exhibits.
I wrote down a question about that, because I'm thinking, how do you show evidence over live stream?
Remote?
Because if you're in the jury, you get to hold it and touch it and look at it and can understand some of the nuances. But over remote,
And I think that's why jury trials are in person,
Mm-hmm.
a big reason. But you might have other hearings where there's evidence, but actually, Pat, it's like if you've seen where you share a screen. You
Right.
share the screen and you see the document or whatever
Yeah.
there. But I think it's recognized that with exhibits, typically
Right.
there are more advantages to being in person.
I'm going to be interested to see how much from COVID is held over. I'm certainly hoping they do the live stream in the committee rooms in the legislature,
Yeah.
because I like sitting at home.
Well, right, and
You know?
oftentimes you have more than one hearing going on at a time
Right.
that you're interested in.
Right.
Yeah.
It's great, and you don't have to worry about parking and all that Montpelier stuff. But the same, I would think, with courts. Some people are just very interested in our judiciary system, and good for
Right.
them. That's
Yeah.
great. So let's talk about that backlog, because when you came on board, I have here, it says, it's estimated that under 1,000 felony cases and nearly 2,200 misdemeanors were pending for more than 2 years. And there's a discussion about wiping them out and saying, "Oh, just kidding."
Well, those
Is that makes sense? Is that going to happen?
Well, those statistics are correct. Those are
Yeah.
accurate
Wow.
statistics. There's a lot, and the main reason, especially in the criminal, when you're talking felonies and misdemeanors,
Yep.
is because of the jury trials that were halted for over a year.
Oh, well, right.
Because jury trials are what move criminal cases. And so there was a backlog before the pandemic.
Oh.
I mean, we've been short-staffed for many years, but it's definitely been worsened because of the pandemic, because of the jury trials coming to a halt. Now jury trials are moving again, which is great, and we don't have to have the 6-foot isolation, for jury boxes. It just makes it
Oh my
much
gosh,
easier
right.
to schedule now. In terms of legislation, it's my understanding that there is discussion along those lines among
Right.
the stakeholders, and it'll be up to the legislature to
Right.
determine what policies make sense for whether or not any.
Because I don't know about you, but I know my memory, if I had to tell you what I was doing on July 8th 2 years ago, that would be a problem for me because
You're right.
2 years is a long time to swear that's what you remember.
Well, and I think that's the purpose behind the speedy
Yeah.
trial, speedy trial,
Because it's
constitutional.
serious stuff when you take that oath about swearing to tell the truth. But if you can't remember the truth, that's even more difficult.
You're exactly right.
Right.
And whether or not there had been the opportunity for depositions,
Right.
certainly there would most likely be written statements, but you're right. The more
Yeah.
time that goes by.
Right. Well, you don't want to look like that. I was in court just once, and I was so nervous. They asked me, "Is your name Pat McDonald?" And I said yes, because when they asked me, "What's your name?" I just kind of went. So they sort of switched the way they asked me questions. But I was very young then, but it was like, oh my God.
No, it's a nerve-wracking
Oh, it is. It's terrible.
situation.
Yeah. So, they're doing, except for jury trials, everything's being done remotely. Is that?
No, not everything.
everything.
In fact, a lot of
They're
in-person
back?
hearings have resumed.
Okay, right.
And I would say, for example, status conferences, for example, would be typically scheduled remotely.
Oh,
If it's an evidentiary hearing where there's evidence, that would typically be in person. The system that they're trying to formulate would involve, whether it's scheduled as an in-person or as a remote, parties would have the opportunity to request the alternative if they felt the reasons were such, and the judge has ultimately the discretion to determine whether it's in-person or remote or hybrid. You might have some witnesses appearing remotely,
I like that.
some in the courtroom.
Yeah.
So it's hoping that we can use the flexibility so that
Good
it
for
makes
you.
sense for the most.
yeah, that's good. Well, I like the flexibility. I really do, and I think people are getting used to it. A lot of times, there's a lot of people cutting, talking over somebody, because that's hard to orchestrate and to manage. But I think it's great for the citizens to be able to participate like that.
Right,
It's
and
great.
we're learning, and
Yeah.
everybody is kind of learning when to mute and unmute. And
So,
like that.
was your staff able to work at home during COVID? A lot of them were home and working, or?
So I came on July of 2022, so I don't know, for example, during the 2 years
Right.
before that, but certainly we learned what could be done remotely
Right.
and all the advantages,
Yeah.
in terms of working remotely. And so it depends kind of on the job. For example, a lot of the technology people are kind of used to working remotely in any event.
Right.
In the courts, in-person, work is typically required for the in-person hearings specifically.
Right.
But for example, if a court has to be closed down for whatever reason, court staff are able to work remotely, processing things that can be done now that all the files are electronic.
Right. Of
Which
course.
was actually, good timing in that sense.
That's great.
Not good timing in terms of trying to learn a whole new case system while the pandemic was, raging. But now that all the files are electronic, it's thank goodness, because it enables people to work
Well,
remotely.
I think it's great because we've always had issues at state government. Can't I work at home? And managers always wanted something very tangible to, like counting widgets, how many widgets in a week. But I think they're more relaxed now, that people are getting their work done, even if it's not documented or countable or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
But I think they trust the employees and they're working, so.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And actually, I think from a wellness perspective, I think people find it more relaxing, for
Yep.
example. And, the point is made that you have fewer distractions at home.
Right,
Because
right.
when you're at work, you might be more
Right.
prone to, chit-chatting or, spending kind of time otherwise.
And
So
I've
that-
heard a couple of companies here, and I've got to check this out, I haven't called the presidents, but they said that the productivity has gotten higher because you're not traveling back and forth, you're not chit-chatting at the water cooler and all of that stuff, that you're
Yeah.
just home working.
It's very interesting. And
Yeah.
nationwide, I think they're finding, studies that, some jobs lend themselves to it very well, and
Yeah.
some people also just prefer. And also some people prefer being on site.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to be able to accommodate,
Well, maybe it's a
people.
split week.
Yeah.
You do need some kind of human contact. And especially, I had a friend of mine who started a new job in the middle of the pandemic, and she never really got to, you
Interact.
can't really meet your coworkers because you're talking business because it's being taped and you're not, so what'd you do this weekend? And you miss that a lot.
You're right, and
You know.
that's actually cited as an example for new employees, that it's best for them to be in person
Right,
for the
right.
initial however many months,
Yeah.
and then perhaps a combination.
Because I like gabbing, so there you go. So I noticed on your, something that's big to me, because I actually did some judicial training a couple of times from personnel, but they said that you're responsible for judicial and employee education. What kind of education do you provide to the judiciary and the employees?
Well, the employees, we did something, this was back in conjunction with the restructuring, that has been a really wonderful process. Every month, every court has a half-day in-service, where the courthouse is closed for a half day, once a month, and that's devoted to training. And every month there's
Great.
like an in-service packet, so that around the state, everybody's getting the same information that month, whether it's new laws, new rules, new processes
I
with
love
the
it.
e-filing. So that's been a great way, because otherwise it was always, when do you find time, and when
Right.
can you get everybody, if somebody's having to man the counter and
Right.
somebody's in the courtroom. So that the half-day in-service training is the primary tool for judiciary staff. Of course, when somebody's new, there's a whole kind of new orientation training program that involves lots
Right.
of different kind of learning and exposing them to, kind of the processes.
Right.
For the judges, there's a very robust judiciary education committee that looks at, when a new judge starts, there's actually a 2-week intensive National Judicial College training for 2 weeks straight. And then a whole orientation where they sit and shadow judges. They have a mentor among the judges.
And that's at any level of judgeship or whatever the term is?
Yeah, whether it's the trial judges, whether it's
Yeah.
the magistrates, there's a hearing officer in the Judicial Bureau. But they really try hard to make sure that there's access to resources, and the judges themselves are they're very supportive of one another. They
Great.
have email lists, they have, I think, either monthly or weekly calls themselves where they can, run ideas off each other. Or,
Great.
so they really try to make sure that judges are supported and court staff are supported.
Do you have an idea in your head at all of how many judges there are in Vermont? I mean,
Well-
obviously the Supremes, but all the...
Yeah, there are 5 justices and then 34 trial judges.
Oh, really?
And 3 magistrates and 1 hearing officer. There are also probate judges, 1 probate
Wow.
judge in each county who are elected. And then also the assistant judges who are elected in each county.
When you mentioned the guardian ad litems, and how did they fare in COVID with the young people that they were supposed to be helping? Maybe you know it before. Maybe you should explain what a guardian ad litem is.
Sure.
Because that is a very responsible job.
Yes, guardians ad litem are integral
Yeah, for
to the
sure.
juvenile docket, and they are volunteers
Yep.
who basically work with the young people in the juvenile docket, in the juvenile system. And they're, in a sense, liaisons in terms of gathering information, in terms of everything impacting that particular person's case, whatever
Yep.
it is. And then they have a role that's a very defined role in the juvenile proceeding. But they serve an incredible function because they kind of gather the information then so that the attorneys or the investigators wouldn't have the ability at the time to gather otherwise. We have, I'm going to say, 300 or so guardians ad litem around the state who are, again, volunteers, who are spending their time. But for them, the juvenile cases actually did proceed during the pandemic because they were considered priority.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, so they did continue to work. To your question about whether they had to meet remotely or in person, I'm going to guess it was a challenge,
Right.
because you might not have a family that has the ability to
Right.
move remotely, and whether or not they met, on the porch or outside. Remember all the times when you had
Because I would think the trust that has to be built up between the child and the guardian ad litem, because I know a couple of them and they've got quite the caseload.
Oh,
I mean, a lot of kids, and I don't know how, and this is all volunteer work, but
Right.
that initial contact of trust building so that the child will talk and feel comfortable.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
I've admired those people
Oh,
that
it's
do
an
that seriously.
It's an incredible
Bless them.
service that they're providing,
Yep.
and I know retired teachers are a component of, but they're always seeking people, very public service minded, civics minded people who are willing to do it. It's not an easy undertaking, but we have some. I mean, some guardians ad litem have been doing it for years and years and years. They're so dedicated to it, and we rely on them completely. And there is a whole guardian ad litem training process, and they do do everything we can to support them. But
They must get so involved with it. Must in some cases must be so hard for them. I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
When I've listened to some of the stories, told carefully so there wasn't any breach of confidence, but I'm thinking, oh my heart be breaking every other day.
Your heart breaks. I did some attorney work for children. You can have attorney representation of children, usually in kind of very contested cases.
Yeah.
And you can't help but get completely wrapped up in their lives and in their issues. But God bless them. They're helping them, and I know it makes a big difference to the children.
Oh, I could imagine for sure.
To know that somebody cares enough.
Yeah, when they turn around in the courtroom and there's somebody, a friendly face that they know and can trust.
That's there to
help them.
Right.
Yep. So when I'm looking through your website, you do this administrative directives. There's quite a few of them. Is that do you have, when you write these? You have to explain what this is, but does that have to be approved by the head of the? Oh my gosh, I went blank on his title.
The court.
The courts. Does the Supreme Court or?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's the Vermont Supreme Court that sets the policy.
Yeah.
So any administrative directive would have as a goal the implementation of that policy.
Right. It's sort of like LCAR, right? That you do.
Oh, yeah.
You kind of explain.
Right, for
the policy.
clarity or for guidance.
Right.
And the ones most recently all had to do with the health and safety protocols for the
I saw
courts.
that.
Yeah, we really had to kind of just make sure that we were abiding by the governor's instructions, and we worked with an expert on courts and what safety in courts. So there is no kind of hard and fast rule, Pat, as to when a directive issues, but it's kind of like when it would be helpful to provide clarity.
Yeah. And that goes well because I think uniformity in the court system is just critical.
Well,
I mean, you can't go to one court and have it do one thing and go to another one and have it do something else. It's got to be uniform.
And that was a big impetus for the restructuring. Because there was more separation back when it was the county courts or the state courts, and even from county to county, you might not have consistency.
Now, were you in the Bar Association when that happened? Because there was a lot of discussion about that when it was announced. What the recommendations were, because change is hard, just like the school changes these days. It's just I had actually just started working in the courts then. Oh.
So I didn't have my role in the Bar Association then, other than, as a practitioner.
Right.
But no, I think everybody recognized the merits to the consistency, and also it's just been a lot more flexible in terms of the chief superior judge, for example, being able to move judges from unit to unit
Makes
or division
so
to division.
Sense.
It's really, it's worked out well that way.
I was sitting in room 11, the big one, room 11,
Yeah.
and I was like, this makes so much sense, but some people weren't quite with me on that. They just don't like change.
No,
So
and I
that's it.
think some people were very kind of partial to their counties, for
Yes, right,
example.
right.
But I think everybody would agree that it really
It's
has
worked
been
out
an
well.
advantage. Yeah.
Has it made it easier for the court administrator, do you think? I mean, made streamlining?
Oh,
Really?
I've got to assume.
Yeah, well, because it's a lot of cooks in that broth, and this is better.
We should talk to Greenie though, because I think he was the one he was court administrator during that time.
Right, yes. Yeah.
He's still in Montpelier. I don't know if you crossed paths
Oh,
with
is
him.
he really? Oh, I'd love to see him.
He sits on the Vermont Labor Relations Board.
Oh, I almost went there the other day. Unfortunately, they settled because apparently something that happened back in speaking of not remembering, it was 1990 something, 91, and my name was in this agreement made between the VSEA and Pat McDonald, and so I was asked by our attorneys, what did I remember? I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I just thought we settled it and it was fixed, but apparently I didn't get called, so I would have seen him.
Yeah.
That would have been fun. I would have felt like I felt somebody knew me. But that was so many years ago. I'm like, you're kidding.
That was
I don't remember what I did
1990 would be
yesterday.
hard.
But and then I have to swear that I'm telling the truth. But anyway, we were talking before the show. The judiciary established a commission on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I must say, I'm going to ask you this. I put this. I didn't see anybody with HR background on that group. That's what flagged for me, that
Yeah.
nobody with personnel experience was on that committee.
And I did ask about that.
Oh, did you?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, and that commission has several committees, one of which is addressing human resources issues such as recruitment and retention and promotions, for example. And John McGlynn, who is the head of human resources of the judiciary, is very much involved in that committee's work.
Yeah.
So I think they are involving certainly human resources
good.
personnel. Otherwise, I think the goal of the commission composition was to have a variety of backgrounds from around the state and different.
Well, yeah, because you had the commission itself was was great. The people on, but I'm like, hey, where's the HR person? But thank you for that. Thank you for checking.
Sure.
That's good. So you also told me there was another group that I didn't know about, and maybe you could explain what that is.
The Vermont Judiciary Commission on Mental Health and the Courts is a commission that Chief Justice Reiber was instrumental in forming, along with his co-chair, Justice Karen Carroll.
Yep.
And this is part of a nationwide effort, actually, Pat, that each Chief Justice in each state is establishing to address the court-involved persons with mental illness. And the best way to identify and to interact and to also ideally, if appropriate and when appropriate, divert them from the court system into treatment.
Right.
And so it's all geared, and kind of what's unique about it is it involves all three branches of the government. So the commission involves legislators as well as members of the agencies, the executive agencies, and the judiciary, trying to work together to figure out how can we best help these people and allow then the courts to proceed in the court operations in the way they're designed to help, because it's not something that people are necessarily trained in. And so one big goal of the commission is to bring training to whether it's judges, court staff, Department of Corrections, legal service providers, the bar, ways to help identify how to identify mental illness, how to best interact, how to best provide support.
That's great.
So,
because every show I've been on that had something to do with this, they talk about how serious mental health is here with children.
Yeah.
And especially now after the pandemic, it's gotten even worse. But I would think, I had Tony Fakos, when he was the chief of police here in Montpelier, he came on the show, he was my go-to law enforcement guy, and he would say that when they're out attending to an issue at somebody's home or something, they started bringing social workers along with them because they're not trained, just like people in the courts aren't trained how to identify, how to handle, how to calm the situation down, and sometimes not meaning to, but it gets escalated because you're saying and doing the wrong thing. And I'm sure you've faced that in the courts at trial.
Exactly. I can remember working in the courts and people at the counter who obviously are not understanding. You know, you're trying to explain and they're not understanding, and then you might have them also get very volatile. And what do we do? And we would then need to basically call law enforcement as a way to kind of help and de-escalate.
Well, that only makes it, when they see law enforcement, that just kind of aggravates the situation, and you feel bad for those folks because they just don't understand. And, and
so
hard to participate when they're in that state of mind.
Right. So I've got to think that with so many good minds trying to figure out the best way, that we've got to come up with a good system.
It's everywhere. It's in corrections. I just had Steve Howard on a show I just did, and he was talking a lot about corrections, and there are people there that need help. Well, and then the correctional guards and stuff, they need to be trained on what to do.
Right.
It's everywhere.
Right, and then the statistics are really amazing in
right.
terms of how many people who are incarcerated who have either
Yep.
mental illness or co-occurring substance abuse, mental illness, or cognitive deficits that also
Oh,
contribute as
right,
well. So
right.
it's a big, but it's got something we've got to face.
Yeah.
And so this.
So when is this due to be done? Do they have a certain amount of time to come back?
Well, the commission is met. It also has committees. There's one committee on
Right.
competency evaluations, because that's one big issue with so many, that's kind of slowing down the process, because we have so few providers who are doing the competency evaluations, and you can't proceed to the next step until that happens.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, but can you
Yeah.
explain that? I guess I'm a little dense.
Well, for example, if it's a potential defense to a charge, if the person's competent or not.
Oh, okay.
And then to have an evaluation
Right,
done.
right, of course.
And there's like everything, there's a limited providers, and so there's a wait list, to have that
Yep.
done, because you need to have that before going on to the assessment
Oh, wow.
and then the treatment. There's a pre-charge diversion committee, a post-charge pretrial services committee, and then a training committee. So each of these committees is working and making recommendations to the commission. The report is due, it's either in 12 months or
Oh, okay, so-
they're actually convening also a summit where we'll have people from around the state come, and again, trying to figure out
Nice.
what's the best way that how can we work together.
Right,
And so it might result in legislative changes, for example.
yeah.
Like right now, it's difficult to do the competency evaluations because there isn't a requirement for the records to be turned over, and you might not have persons willing to do that.
Oh.
So whether the legislature kind of, imposes a requirement,
right.
something.
And
so
then you've got an issue of personal freedom and personal and stuff, and
all this
HIPAA,
balancing.
whatever else comes into play.
Right, but I mean, it's not going to go away by ignoring it. So we have to try to figure out, at least make small steps to help.
And I was just thinking of the poor guardian ad litems who are volunteers. I'm hoping that they're somewhat included in that training, because if they're dealing with young kids
Oh.
who are struggling, and after
Yeah.
COVID.
That's a great.
Oh, thank you. Just put
Yes.
that down.
Well, I was going to say, because we've applied for a grant
Yeah.
that the federal government is allocating so much per state. It's not even a competitive grant, but we want to take advantage of it for
Yeah.
training. So the guardians ad litem were not on the list, but I think they
Oh, they
definitely
should be, I would think, because
Yeah.
they need to understand that, because kids are very clever at hiding things, or telling you what they think you need to know, and you may not understand how deeply troubled they are.
That's a great suggestion.
Because I know suicide here in Vermont in teens is not getting better. And
I read that
Yeah,
the
it's bad.
suicide rate is high in Vermont.
yep, it
in any
is.
event.
And because they're very good at letting you know what you want to hear, not necessarily how they're feeling, and they keep things inside. And hopefully the guardian ad litems would gain their trust and maybe see those signs before things get out of control.
Right, you see studies where this child might say, I tried to tell people, but they're not coming right out to tell them, and it's all these
Exactly,
signs, and if you can
exactly.
identify those signs, then that will help.
Yeah, and it's funny, we want to talk fast, but I was working with somebody years ago who actually committed suicide, and afterwards we looked back, and there was red flags and signs everywhere, and shame on us for we just didn't see it. We knew him, he was personable, but he followed the signs of giving away things, calling people,
Oh,
all the things that are flags,
interesting.
and we didn't know, and it was just since then I've shaped up a little, because that was quite a
Eye-opening experience,
Yeah.
that must have been.
It was.
Oh, interesting. I guess I would have, if somebody was giving away things too, I wouldn't necessarily
Yeah, no, just
made
a
that
flea market,
connection.
giving stuff away, calling people, and it was apparently those are all signs of that, and a bunch of other stuff, but
Yeah.
signs that you just dismiss because you know him and seems like a nice guy, and
Yeah, there was actually an increase in suicides among lawyers, and there's a commission on the well-being of the legal profession several years ago now that same thing, to bring about training to help identify, because there's a lot of stress involved
Right.
with the practice of law, and same thing with medicine.
for sure.
The rates are very high.
Yep. Well,
but-
we're doing a show about first responders, and the stress that they have, what they see every day.
Oh.
And because they're going from one disaster to another, they sort of push it down, and they don't have help.
I can
And all of a
see
sudden,
that.
it just blows
Wow.
up, and there you go.
Well, one thing too that's coming out of that is the destigmatization of getting
Yes.
mental health treatment. I feel like we have made progress there.
I agree with you.
And that's a big part of it, is
Yep.
trying to tell people it's
Yeah,
okay.
it's
and
okay.
It's, yeah.
Well, and even our own state, they kept mental health, Representative Ann Donahue would tell me that they kept mental health separate from the health committee in the legislature. They kept it separate, but it is a recognized disease. It is an issue of health.
Like-
It's just part of health, just like a cold or asthma, or I don't know
Diabetes
what
or-
else I can think of.
Yeah.
But they purposely kept it separate. And that showed you where their minds were at, but they have
Yeah.
finally, and you're right, they have finally put it together under one committee.
Wow.
Because why is it different?
Yeah.
It's just different in where, and it's not so physical, but
Right. Well, and I think people also being open about, I get mental health treatment, and it helped me, to hear those stories. I feel like that has helped people too, saying,
Yeah.
well, gosh.
well, I
Yeah.
hope that they reach out to the kids, because that's pretty.
Well, I thank
Well,
you for
thanks.
that tip for the Guardians of Lightum.
Let's go. All right, so we have about 11 minutes left, and I wanted to bring up an issue that no throwing a thing, but ethics.
Yes.
We were testifying at Senate GovOps, I think, mostly, on different sides of the ethics.
So how were you involved with that testimony?
I'm a lobbyist for Campaign for Vermont, and this
Oh,
show
okay.
is sort of associated with Campaign for Vermont, and
Okay.
Ben Kinsley, who's one of the co-hosts. And
Right, so that's how I also
yes,
would have seen
and
you.
the chair of Senate GovOps always included us in a lot of testimony, because we're always writing things about what we agree with and don't
I
agree.
miss her
already.
already.
I do. Isn't she, Jeanette? She's just so wonderful.
Yeah.
And she's got such a great personality about her. And a very good chair. I mean,
Yes.
that woman. There's
She
some
moved.
chairs could learn a lot from Jeanette.
She knew how to move
And
legislation.
Donna Swaney too, who was my other favorite. I don't know which one is my more favorite, but they both were House and Senate GovOps, and
Oh, that's
they
right.
had the same style. They just got it done. But there was we were surprised, I think, and I don't know how to explain what. We just thought it was a good idea. Mine was a little different take than Ben on it. I've known people that want to complain about somebody, but they were afraid to go to the judiciary. There was, I've heard about some issues with people, but they didn't want to go to the judiciary. They were afraid to go to the same body that the person they were complaining about.
Oh.
And this sets up a supposedly separate, not involved, a non-biased group that they can go to anonymously for, at least initially anyway. And that makes it the same if you have a legislator. You don't want to go to the legislature to complain about the legislature. It kind of closes ranks.
Yeah.
And-
Well, when you mentioned about the judiciary opposing the ethics bill, and so I wasn't part of the judiciary then,
Right,
but I
no.
was part of the Bar Association.
Right.
And mainly, and I think the bar's position was similar to the judiciary's position, just in terms of inconsistencies between the Code of Ethics and the Code of Judicial Conduct
Oh.
and the Code of the Rules of Professional Conduct, and trying to make sure that, I guess where there was overlap, that there was clarity in
Right.
terms of which applied. I felt like that was the main situation.
Well, there
versus,
certainly shouldn't be any competing interests. They shouldn't be
and
different.
and that's what we did ultimately work out in terms of the language
Right.
and in terms of the training, because there's a ton of ethics training already
Right,
in the
right.
judiciary and in the bar. And so kind of also clarifying that as well. So I think once the language was,
You're
worked
okay
out,
with that?
and you asked about implementing it, for example, the deadline for doing the mandatory ethics training was December 1.
Right.
And my understanding is that we had 100%
Great,
compliance
great.
with members of the judiciary
'Cause-
with that training.
Yeah.
So I think that was, to me, the issue, not, we don't want to abide by the ethics. It was, we have this actually very kind of centuries in the making, if you will, ethics rules.
Right.
And the other thing, I think the other aspect was some of the rules just being very unique in terms of whether it's judges or attorneys,
judiciary, right.
conflicts of interest,
Yep.
for example, or appearances of impropriety. It has different meanings in the different contexts, in the course of representation. So that's where I think
I looked at it as when the feds pass a law, the state can pass a similar law, but it has to be stricter or the same. It can't be less. And I looked at this as similar to that you pass a statewide law that everybody has to abide by, but you, the judiciary, can make it stricter, can make it even beyond what was said. Because everything is unique, and I agree with you about that if you've got the judges. But this is Vermont and conflict of interest. If they ever got to the municipalities, that would keep you busy.
I'm on my town's planning commission, so
Great.
I know of what you speak.
Yes, I love I think he's long since off but he was on the planning commission. I think he owned a quarter of the town. But that's just Vermont, The people that are interested are the people that are involved. So thank goodness they step up.
But I think that, to me, that was kind of what took the time to just make sure that kind of the language that was a kind of blanket language was parsed out so that there wouldn't be some kind of just either illogical or inconsistent application to what already exists in the Code of Judicial Conduct or the professional rules of conduct. So.
And that's my little taste of legislature. I miss it a little bit, but
the back and forth.
Right, it's kind of cool playing the game and testifying and seeing if you can win people over. That's always some kind of a charge. But when I was commissioner of motor vehicles, I made it a requirement that all new employees would have to go to the State House because that's why we're there, right across the street, and let's go see.
Oh.
And I brought one woman over. She was shaking like a leaf, sweating, and I'm like, I don't want to go in there, I'm afraid. And that's what got me started on the ethics thing because she was so afraid, she didn't know what to expect. It was kind of like this,
an intimidating.
like, oh my God, the State House.
Oh.
And of course, you and I work there, and it's like, whatever. But for other people who don't know, it's pretty intimidating, right?
Interesting.
And she was scared to death. And so I went over with her and introduced her, and she was fine afterwards, but they won't go. So if there's somebody that they want to complain about, they just don't want to go because they're afraid of what's going to happen with them.
Yeah, well, I do think in terms of, people in the public wouldn't necessarily know this or appreciate it, but when there is a complaint, whether it's against a judge or whether it's against an attorney,
right?
To me, the bodies that sit to decide, are very strict on the judges and on the attorneys,
right.
And it includes lay people, it includes attorneys, it includes, the idea is to try to get, not just, we're going to protect this person. I think it's, and they will, you can look at the number of, outcomes against, a judge or an attorney to know that they take it seriously, to make sure that if there are complaints, that they're investigated and that justice is done. But, if you're a member of the public, you wouldn't necessarily have a recognition of that.
It's just the public just doesn't know. It's a big building, and they're like, whoa,
Yeah.
I was looking at, and then she wasn't the only one. There were quite a few that didn't want to go, and I had to make them. I said, it's part of the deal. We're here because of them, and we're implementing their laws. So you've got to understand.
And hopefully, once they went,
they're fine.
Yeah, I was going to say,
but it was getting over that.
Yeah,
and
right.
I was with them. So if they have to complain about somebody and they have to go by themselves, they never would.
They might not.
So that was why that was my push.
Oh, that's a great idea. Plus, it's so convenient. You might as well take advantage of the chance to.
Exactly. So one more thing before we close out the show. In your job description, it talks about your role as a liaison with the Supreme Court and the boards and committees that you have. But I'm also, even though it didn't say that, it's also got to be the other branches of government with the administration and the legislature. Do you reach out to them, and how does that work? Do you have trouble with that gang?
Oh, well, I guess maybe from prior roles. I've had interaction with the legislature and
Right.
with the governor's office as well. They've been actually very involved with Vermont Bar Association, whether it's the Martin Luther
right.
King Jr. poster essay contest or
Right.
things along those
Right.
lines.
That's right.
Yeah. So one huge advantage of Vermont, I feel like we're so lucky to be so small because people get to know one another, and I
Right.
think we all are working for so many common goals, that there's a lot of collaboration. And the Supreme Court actually has, during the pandemic, for example, every week, the Supreme Court would meet with the Bar Association president, the
Oh.
executive director, the bar, to keep each other apprised, and they continue those meetings monthly.
Oh, that's great.
There's a lot of close collaboration, and we're so grateful to the legislature for all the assistance they've provided and the resources to the judiciary. I mean, they've been very supportive, and the governor's office too. I mean, we're in communication thinking, how can we, for example, address the backlog? The governor's made it a priority, to help with resources and
Right.
recognizing the need. And so I think it's a big advantage that people know one another and can work together. And
And it's Vermont, you wind up knowing some of the Supreme Court judges and knowing that they're just regular folk. I remember Marilyn Scoglin, Judge Scoglin. I mean, she was the woman singer on the Grand Old Op. Was it? No. Oh, what was the name of the band? She used to sing in the
she
band.
has so many talents, it's hard to keep
Unbelievable.
track of.
Yeah. Well, she said she's the girl singer in the. I can't remember the name of it. It was a great band. I was sort of a groupie and follow
Oh.
them around.
Oh, wow.
But then Justice Reiber is wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, and they've been very approachable, and
Yep.
they're liaisons. They serve on a lot of the rules committees, the oversight committees
Ah.
as well, because they're part of their big
Right.
role as administration, and they take it very seriously.
And an individual in this state can actually change law.
Yes.
I've seen it happen where one person thought something was not right and went to a legislator, and the next thing you know, it becomes a bill, and they've single-handedly changed law. And I don't think people realize how accessible our courts are and our legislatures are.
I think another context that I met you in was in legislator days,
Oh,
where
I
we
bet.
invite the local legislators to come to the courts for a day, observe
Right.
court hearings,
Yep.
meet with the judges.
Oh, yes. Oh, I went to in front of the Supreme Court, there was somebody, and I was so surprised how you come prepared.
Oh.
But they can interrupt you,
The red-
stop you, hit the bell, and I would be so flustered. I really give the attorneys a lot of credit to be able to respond and to answer the judges and still remember where they left off in their speech. So
That
that
is-
is very interesting.
It's a nerve-wracking
Yeah,
situation, but
exactly.
we just had legislator days in all the counties in person again because we had
Oh,
to
nice.
not have them in person during the
Nice.
pandemic, and we had a great turnout, especially from the new legislators
Great.
coming and seeing
Oh, that's-
court hearings.
That's
yeah.
great. I think they're going to be so overwhelmed with people trying to educate them. But that's it for what's it? 1/3 of the legislature is new,
That's what
and we've lost some serious long-term chairs.
Jeanette,
Oh,
good
whoa.
example, yeah.
It's going to be interesting. Well, thank you very much for coming on board. I think this
My
is great.
pleasure.
I really enjoyed chatting with you, Terry.
Oh,
and
me too.
I wish you a lot of luck. If you want to come back on anytime, let me know.
Well, and if there's any issues that are of interest or
Yeah.
things that develop, don't hesitate. I'm just down the road.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vermont. What is the title of this show? Vote for Vermont. Who knows? Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Thank you very much.